So, Chapter 263 of JJK is out. For the first time in what feels like months, we got back-to-back JJK chapters. Even though technically we didn't really get back-to-back JJK chapters because the JJK chapter last week was the continuation of the chapter we got a month prior to that. But still, JJK content came out 2 weeks in a row. I feel like I'm being spoiled. I don't know what to do with my body. But does that mean that Chapter 263 was worth celebrating? Not really. See, listen, I don't want to lie to you. A lot does happen in this chapter, and things do look pretty good for the good guys. But wow, is there a lot of Gegeisms. Now, what I mean when I say Gegeisms is essentially something happens, and then either that something that happened is explained away with either a binding vow, or is just said to be happening. Because so far as I currently understand from this chapter, there is 2 unexplained binding vows, 1 binding vow that should be considered broken, and just 1 thing that kind of just happens and nobody tells us why it happened. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, that last thing might have also been a binding vow. So there is 3 non-explained binding vows and 1 possible broken binding vow in this chapter. But then again, prior to this, all I've done is read the Twitter leaks, so now as I go through the more comprehensive, better translated leaks, maybe things will make more sense to me. But as it currently stands, while this chapter was hype and we did get a lot of plot developments for a lot of crucial characters, can't help but feel like we're sprinting towards the end for no particular reason. See, because in this chapter, we not only get the aftermath of Gota's purple, the collapse of Gota's body, the breaking of Toto's Vibra slap, and a black flash from Sukuna, but we also get the reveal of a character that we believe was gone from the story, re-entering the fray to be possibly the final combatant to Sukuna, and so much more. So while I may not be thrilled about the execution, there's a lot to talk about this chapter. So let's get right into it, because today we're talking Chapter 263 of JJK, Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me bringing anime topics to the real life, go ahead and follow my brand new project that I'm doing with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL, where we take real life challenges to the anime world. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. But before we get into all that today, guys, first we gotta talk about a brand new sponsor to the page, Fume. Fume is trying to create a healthy alternative to smoking and vaping. And that healthy alternative is the flavored air category. See, Fume is trying to initiate a change that will revolutionize people's health choices. And when it comes to the flavored air category, there is nobody better than Fume. Fume is an award-winning flavored air device. It helps you draw flavor to your mouth, filling the void that ditching a bad habit can leave, making sure you still have something to reach for. But Fume isn't a vape, it's just air. As such, there's no vapor, no smoke, no nicotine, so it's not addictive. And all the flavors are non-toxic, so it's a completely guilt-free option. On top of that, it's powered by your breath, so no batteries needed. And I must say, the wood and metal design makes it look kind of awesome. It's heavy, it feels good in your hand, it twists, which is kind of fun for those of you who like to fidget, and it comes with a magnetic holder that you can spin it on, and trust me when I say I play with this all day. And so, if hitting a vape is like drinking a sticky soda, then using the flavor cores, of which Fume has a ton of, is more like drinking an herbal tea, like crisp mint, sparkling grapefruit, or maple pepper. And my personal favorite is crisp mint. It's like walking around with gummin. It's a cool, refreshing hit of mint to the mouth. So if you or a loved one has a bad habit you're trying to kick, I can recommend nothing higher than Fume. And once you buy in, you'll join the ranks of 300,000 other customers on their way to a success story. So use the QR code on screen or enter code Weeb at checkout to get the free Fume base when you order the Journey Pack. And in no time, you'll be spinning just like me. So go to tryfume.com, that's TRYFUM.com, and enter the code Weeb at checkout or scan the QR code on screen right now to get a free Fume base with your order of the Journey Pack. So Chapter 263 starts off where Chapter 262 left off. Well, more I should say, Chapter 263 shows the aftermath of the end of 262. And for those of you who don't remember 7 days ago, go to the doctor, but I'll remind you that the end of 262 was Gota using a blue to pull up a tape recorder that had Inamaki's voice saying, "Don't move," which froze Sukuna in place and allowed for Gota to line up a purple that would apparently destroy the domain clash. At least that's what was revealed in Chapter 263. Because in Chapter 263, we see the basketball-sized orb that was the domain clash between Malevolent Shrine and Unlimited Void begin to burst at the seams until eventually it explodes with tremendous force. force. And it's at this point that the narrator tells us that the small domain has been destroyed. And thus out of the chaos flies Sukuna with his skin charred. And he's thinking to himself, you really got me. You managed to fire off a hollow purple, the ultimate technique of Gojo, a technique you should not be used to doing. However, in the same moment that Sukuna is thinking about how impressive it is that Gota fired off a hollow purple, he's acknowledging the fact that Gota, when he fired off his hollow purple, not only hit Sukuna, but also hit his own domain, destroying the unlimited void, which is probably something that Gojo wouldn't have done, because we talked about this last week. There were a couple of different things that could have happened after Gota fired off this purple. Either Gota could misfire, which would lead to Sukuna exposing an opening, or Gota could hit Sukuna, which would cause Sukuna to take enough damage that his domain would crumble. And in the second that Sukuna's domain crumbled, unlimited void would hit him, filling his brain with infinite information, which probably would have been game, set, match. However, what Sukuna is telling us in this moment is that Gota's purple also hit his own domain, and thus Sukuna, while being hit by the hollow purple, wasn't hit by unlimited void. Now, following Sukuna immediately out of the chaos of the domain class exploding are Todo, Gota, and Yuji. And Todo was yelling at Gota that it doesn't matter whether or not you intend to hit us. The second that your curse technique recovers, fire as many hollow purples at Sukuna as you can. Todo then assures Gota that no matter how many hollow purples he fires, that he'll use his boogie woogie to avoid all of them. And thus essentially Todo is calling in danger close. Now as this dynamic trio, or I guess dynamic foursome, because it's like Yuta and Gojo. As this dynamic team closes in on Sukuna, the narrator tells us that Sukuna has once again entered a state where using curse techniques is difficult after the failing of a domain expansion, which, as we all know, doesn't really mean much, because one, he'll probably just recover in minutes, and two, if he's not recovering fast enough, he'll just hit a black flash and then he'll recover faster. However, Sukuna isn't the only person feeling the effects of the clash of domains, because even though Gota was right alongside Todo and Yuji running at Sukuna, he collapses, all but immediately. At which point the narrator tells us that the technique that Yuta copied from Kenjaku, the body swapping technique, has burnt out because of the domain clash, which means that essentially Yuta can't control Gojo's body right now because the curse technique that he got from Kenjaku is burnt out because of the domain clash. So we didn't have to worry about the 5-minute timeline. However, Yuta's not dead. In fact, he's still thinking. As the moment he hits the ground, we get a step into his thoughts, where he thinks, since Rika isn't haunting this body, I figured the technique that would burn out because of a domain clash would be the limitless. So he figured, since Kenjaku's technique technically isn't his and is only his because he was able to copy it when Rika was haunting his body, that after the clash of domains he would still be able to use Gojo's body because Kenjaku's curse technique wasn't technically his. But this causes Yuta's brain to reel as he realizes that Kenjaku has also used the domain expansion before, specifically in the battle for Tengen. However, after Kenjaku used his domain expansion, his body continued to function, and thus since Kenjaku was able to move after a clash of domains, there must surely be a trick to restarting his fried curse technique. However, Yuta doesn't know the trick. He didn't get any of that information from what he got from copying this technique. And thus, as he lays there somewhat lifelessly, he thinks to himself that he needs to make a barrier for Todo and Yuji. Now, this happening is actually rather interesting. See, because Yuta did rather aptly assume that the curse technique that would burn out would be that of Gojo's. However, Kenjaku's curse technique being the one that burnt out seems to imply that Gojo's body has somehow stolen Kenjaku's curse technique. See, because yes, the only real reason that Yuta should be able to use Kenjaku's body swapping technique is because of his copy ability. His copy ability that has a timer on it. And thus, somewhat ironically, that copy ability should be tied to Yuta's body, which Rika is still haunting. But this is kind of good news. See, the fact that the curse technique that got burnt out was Kenjaku's body swapping technique seems to imply that Gota's body now has that curse technique. That somehow either Yuta's brain or Gojo's body has appropriated that curse technique for the Frankenstein amalgamation that is currently Gota. Otherwise, that wouldn't have been the curse technique that burnt out, which means that after 5 minutes is up, there's a solid possibility that Yuta's still just in Gojo's body. So while this might just seem like a convenient way to make sure that Gota's not in the battle against Sukuna, I also believe it's setting up the fact that Gojo/Yuta will survive through the medium of Gota. And as Gota is laying there now, somewhat lifelessly, Todo looks back and thinks he's at his limit. But you should never look backwards in a fight. Todo learns that lesson rather quickly, because as soon as he looks forward, the first thought that comes to his mind is, oh, The King of Curses is impressive, because in the heat of this battle, with something as crazy as Gota collapsing, he's noticed my temporary lapse in attention span and is now, he's a lot closer to me than I thought he was gonna be. And it's at this point that Sukuna does the thing. Sukuna closes the distance between him and Todo and immediately hits Todo with a black flash that not only probably restarts his curse techniques, but also destroys Todo's Vibra Slap. Now, this is aggravating for two separate reasons. The first of which being, we get it, every time Sukuna needs to jumpstart his curse techniques, he hits a black flash. It's happened like 4 or 5 times now. But also, like, the novelty of black flashes has kind of just disappeared. Like, here's the thing. Obviously, when Yuji hits a bunch of black flashes, I'm like, oh, that's crazy. But that's because Yuji doesn't have a lot going for him, and fists are how he fights. So him being able to string together a series of 8 or so black flashes is incredibly hype. But Sukuna hitting a black flash literally anytime it's even remotely convenient is just, I don't know. It's just old. He did it against LaRue. He did it against Maki twice. He's done it against Todo. He's done it against Yuji. Like, they clearly can't be as hard as people are saying they are. Now, I get it. There's a possibility that the reason that Yuji is able to hit so many black flashes is his connection to Sukuna, but that's never been established. It's just, the bit's getting old. The second reason this is upsetting is because Todo's Vibra Slap has been broken. And I don't know if you guys remember the binding vow that Todo made in order to allow his Vibra Slap to enact his Boogie Woogie, but the key point of the binding vow, so far as I remember, was that the metal part of the Vibra Slap has to hit the wooden part of the Vibra Slap to enact Boogie Woogie. And because of this binding vow, Todo is now able to use Boogie Woogie up to 50 times a minute, and he had increased the range of his Boogie Woogie pretty substantially. So now that the ball metal part of the Vibra Slap has been broken off, hypothetically, he shouldn't be able to use Boogie Woogie. And he immediately uses Boogie Woogie. See, because after hitting a black flash on Sukuna, Sukuna realizes that Yuji is behind him, lining up some punches. And thus Sukuna reels to turn around and to punch Yuji. However, when he goes to punch Yuji, he realizes that Yuji isn't there. And that's because Todo has Boogie Woogied Yuji into Sukuna's blind spot. But why? Why can Todo use Boogie Woogie even though his binding vow has now essentially been broken? Well, according to Todo, it's because he came out late and he wants to show off more. At least, that's what he yells out when he Boogie Woogies Yuji into Sukuna's blind spot. But in actuality, the way that Todo explains it to us, how he's still able to use Boogie Woogie, is actually explained by Sukuna, kind of. See, because as Sukuna is catching the fate of a lifetime from Yuji for like the 17th time, Sukuna's thinking to himself, the mass of Akotsu's energy. The shards of Gota's barrier are flittering around instead of disappearing. If those don't disappear, this sets the greatest yet stage for Boogie Woogie to shine unrivaled. And I have absolutely no idea what that means. See, essentially what's being said here in layman's terms is when Gota fired off a hollow purple into Sukuna's chest, while it did destroy the Clash of Domains and Malevolent Shrine, it didn't completely destroy Unlimited Void. See, while it did technically destroy the curse technique that's applied to the barrier that makes it a domain expansion, it didn't fully destroy the barrier, which means that the continuation of this battle between Todo, Yuji, and Sukuna is existing within Gota's barrier. Now, we don't necessarily know what the rules of this barrier are, but we can assume because this is Gota's barrier that somehow, some way, Yuji and Todo are getting some kind of cursed energy boost. Or something. It's literally not explained. And this is one of the points of this chapter that makes me a little bit upset. Anyways, while Sukuna is thinking all of this, Todo is now using the metal part, or I guess the wooden part. I don't really remember how a Vibra Slap works. It's the part that looks like a bell to enact Boogie Woogie. But Nick, how's he doing it without the ball part? Oh, you know, by slapping it against his forehead? Because, actually, I don't know why. But basically, Todo keeps slapping that Vibra Slap like a drum, and Yuji keeps appearing in places that Sukuna could never have guessed. And thus, Yuji continues delivering a flurry of blows into Sukuna, none of which are black flashes, but let's remember that every single time Yuji strikes Sukuna, he strikes at the separation between Sukuna and Megami's soul. So while black flashes deliver more force, any singular time Yuji comes into contact with Sukuna, it should be shaking his connection to Megami. Now, Todo continues freestyling what a Vibra Slap means to him as he proceeds to put it in his mouth, and Yuji continues freestyling with what beating down Sukuna means to him, until eventually he places his open palm hand on Sukuna's stomach, all while thinking to himself, as many times as I have to, Fushiguro, wake up. He then uses Dismantle. But he doesn't just use Dismantle to cut away Sukuna's abdomen. No, Yuji makes a binding vow with himself to restrict Dismantle's target to specifically the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's soul, which means that the Dismantle that Yuji is currently blasting into Sukuna's body should have a greater effect. Because Yuji's not just blasting a Dismantle into Sukuna's body, he's blasting a greatly diminished Dismantle at a specific target, which should therefore be more deadly to said target. Because, just like with Nen, risk increases power. But since I'm trying to be as non-biased as possible, this is also objectively kind of silly. Limiting the target of your technique to exactly you want to hit to increase its power is just a silly mechanic. That'd be like me being like, oh, this bullet can only hit you in the brain while shooting you point blank. And now that it can only hit you in the brain, it does double brain damage. I don't know. For some reason, I just find it silly. But a lot of you are probably saying, but Nick, this means that Dismantle can only ever be used on the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's soul. Right? Well, if that was the scenario, then I would say, yes, this is a cool application of a binding vow. But no, that's not the scenario, and I'll tell you why in a second. Before we get there, Sukuna reels back from this Dismantle and thinks, because he made a binding vow limiting the technique's application, it's doing way more damage to the barrier between me and Megami's souls than just standard punches. Sukuna then thinks to himself, if I keep being hit by these, and then he throws up a bunch of fingers. He then looks down at these fingers and says, I won't be able to maintain this body. He then shoves all the fingers back in his mouth, which I don't know, seems pretty terrible as a weakness if you ask me. Like, oh, we're knocking the fingers out of him, but then if he can just reconsume the fingers, then it's not all that big of a deal. I guess you could fumble a couple of them and then lose them, but he's got a bunch of arms. Sukuna then, with his now throw-up covered hand, jumps backwards onto a pillar. And here's where things get a little bit silly. Because the pillar that Sukuna is standing on, Yuji immediately uses Dismantle on, which destroys the pillar that Sukuna is standing on and causes Sukuna to fall. Which means that the binding vow that Yuji made to only use Dismantle on the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's soul is now null and void. But since the rule of breaking a binding vow that you made with yourself is only the loss of what you gained through said binding vow, Yuji can do this, and it just means that if Yuji wants to strike the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's soul, he then, once again, has to make the same binding vow. Which is why the binding vow mechanic, at least when you're making a binding vow with yourself, is just inherently kind of silly. It has no consequences whatsoever. You just make a binding vow when it's convenient and break it when it's convenient, make another one when it's convenient, and move on with that cycle forever. And the overusage of binding vows and the overusage of black flashes is just taking a lot of the intrigue and fun out of this fight, because there's always some kind of plot device on both sides of these fights that's going to allow the other person to prevail temporarily. But Sukuna is now currently falling off this now destroyed pillar towards Yuji, and he's thinking to himself that it doesn't matter if Yuji's able to strike the barrier between his and Megami's souls so long as he doesn't get hit, which he does a pretty good job of because he dodges the punch that Yuji's trying to land on him mid-air and slams Yuji into the wall. We then cut to Todo, who's thinking to himself that the spare Vibra Slap he brought probably won't be registered as his left hand, so it won't work. Now, to break that down, because it is somewhat confusing, let's remember that Todo lost his left hand in the battle against Mahito. He then replaced his left hand with a Vibra Slap. He then made a binding vow that said anytime the wooden part of the Vibra Slap hit the metal part of the Vibra Slap, he can enact Boogie Woogie, essentially replacing his left hand with a Vibra Slap. That Vibra Slap is now broken, but for some reason, still works. But apparently, Todo, anticipating the fact that his child's toy would be broken in one of the most dangerous battles of all time, decided to bring a spare Vibra Slap. However, Todo believes that if he yanks out his old broken Vibra Slap and stabs in a new one into the nub of his left arm, that the binding vow that he made to make his old Vibra Slap his left hand and therefore the medium of Boogie Woogie won't apply to the new Vibra Slap, and thus the flame of Boogie Woogie will die. And thus Todo thinks to himself, just once more. Hold it together as he holds his Vibra Slap above his head and goes to probably hit it against his own head. We don't really know what he hits it against. It's actually kind of unclear. And while Todo is doing this one final Boogie Woogie swap, Sukuna and Yuji are facing down each other in a hallway. And the second that Todo strikes his Vibra Slap, or what's left of it, on something, Sukuna thinks to himself, switch. However, Yuji doesn't move. Instead, Angel/Hana appears above Sukuna. And with her, she has her holy trumpet thing. She's activating her technique extinguishment technique, which you can only use through the medium of her holy trumpet thing. I don't know if we ever exactly get a name for it, but it's like a megaphone with wings. And thus it's revealed that the final Boogie Woogie swap was not for Yuji, but instead Hana, to get her in position to once again fire off her technique extinguishment technique at Sukuna. But this time, not cut it off halfway. But it's already been established that Hana/Angel's innate technique extinguishment, is pretty much the deadliest thing out there for somebody like Sukuna, as Sukuna himself is effectively a cursed object, and thus by removing the curse from said cursed object through the technique extinguishment technique, Sukuna's soul will be eradicated from Megami as a vessel, much in the same way Gojo's soul was freed from the prison realm. But before we get to see Hana fire off what we assume to be a maximum output Jacob's Ladder, we cut to a flashback between Yuta and Hana. Well, actually, before we get to the flashback, we're told by the narrator that the range of Todo's Boogie Woogie was made greater by a binding vow. What's the binding vow? We don't know. I mean, well, yes, of course, it can be widely assumed that the binding vow was Todo saying that this is the last time he's going to use this Viper Slap for Boogie Woogie, and therefore he was able to increase the range because of that. But if we're being entirely real with ourselves, he shouldn't have been able to use Boogie Woogie with that Viper Slap in the first place. And thus him making a binding vow with the Viper Slap he probably shouldn't be using in the first place, saying this is the last time I'm going to use this Viper Slap I shouldn't be using in the first place, and getting an increase in his range because of said binding vow does seem a bit thin. And it is also the third binding vow of this chapter. Like, at this point, I genuinely believe Gege is trolling. Because you know what you don't have to do? Exactly that. Hey man, Hana could be close. You don't have to say she was far away. You don't have to say Todo did a binding vow to reach her a mile away. She could have just been around the corner, waiting for her opportunity to strike against Sukuna. There is literally no logical reason to involve a binding vow in this moment. And yet, here we are. Anyways, let's go to the flashback. Angel and Tana are having a conversation with Yuta, where Angel is telling Yuta that it was our job to free Gojo from the prison seal. After that, we're done. However, Hana, who is obsessed with Megami, wants to know from Yuta how Megami is doing. Or at least she wants to know what will happen to Megami if he's hit with a maximum output Jacob's Ladder. Now, Yuta responds to this by not answering the question and simply saying, I apologize, Angel and Hana, but we may have to rely on you in the end of this battle. Yuta continues on by saying, you don't have to join the fight, and that even if my domain is defeated, we'll set up a scenario in which you can be involved in the battle without being injured. That is to say that Yuta is essentially telling them that we're going to set up a scenario in which you can use maximum output Jacob's Ladder and not have to worry about Sukuna getting to you. And it's in that scenario that I want you to hit him with Jacob, and through the power of your Jacob's Ladder, split up Megami and Sukuna's souls. And thus, in the end of this battle, we'll use the strength of my copy technique, which confuses and intrigues Hana and Angel. See, because so far as they understood, Yuta had already copied their technique, which is why he was able to apply it to his domain expansion in his battle against Sukuna. But Yuta goes on to explain that once a technique is copied, people tend to ignore the original technique holder. Yuta explains that for some reason or another, the second that I copy a technique, people stop considering the fact that the original user of the technique may also show up on the battlefield. This goes doubly so if they understand how I'm able to copy a technique, which is consuming a part of somebody with Rika. And thus many people assume that if I'm using somebody's technique, that I've either stolen it or killed them. And thus Yuta says the true strength of copying is using both of the cards simultaneously. And it's at this point that we see Hana yelling, maximum output Jacob's Ladder, and we see a ray of light descending through the center of Shinjuku. And it's at this point that the narrator plays us out by saying the Joker, as in the Joker card, played at the last minute. What will be the result of this great contest, implying that this may actually be the final move ever taken against Sukuna. And I gotta say, I do kind of like it. See, because specifically in the last two chapters, Yuta has used this power of his copy technique to push Sukuna into scenarios where the original users of the techniques that Yuta has copied show their strength. He did it in 262 with Inamaki and the tape recorder, and he's now done it again in 263 with Hana and her maximum output Jacob's Ladder. And while this would now constitute the third time that Sukuna has been hit with this technique, the first time that Sukuna was hit with this technique, he was in a comparable situation as to the one he's currently in. That is to say that the first time that Hana hit Sukuna with a maximum output Jacob's Ladder, he had just become Megami's controller, and thus his control over Megami's soul was weak. And this is why Sukuna had to plead with Hana to stop destroying Megami's body, something that inevitably led to her getting a big old bite taken out of her. And now, while objectively he was hit with it a second time and it barely phased him, I mean, it did phase him, but it basically just weakened the connection between him and Megami so that Yuji could fly in and miss on his reach out to Megami. It's already been set up in this chapter that Yuji's punches to the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's souls, or I guess more specifically his dismantles to the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's souls, has put Sukuna in an incredibly disadvantageous situation, where he probably currently has the least control over Megami as a vessel as he's ever had, outside of maybe the time in Yuji's domain after after he was hit by maximum output Jacob's Ladder. So is this the end for Sukuna? Who knows, man? I think it is a legitimate possibility that this is the end for Sukuna. Because after this, if we genuinely keep this fight going, it's pointless. Hana showing up and hitting Sukuna with a maximum output Jacob's Ladder is the 7th final plan they've had. The initial plan was Gojo. The plan after that was Hikaruma. The plan after Hikaruma was Yuta. The plan after Yuta was Maki. The plan after Maki was Todo. The plan after Todo was Gota. And apparently the plan after Gota is Hana. Oh, I forgot. There was also Miguel and LaRue in there. Genuinely, I believe that this isn't the thing that finishes off Sukuna. Continuing this fight in any capacity whatsoever that seems as though it's going for the good guys would be disingenuous. But at the same time, pulling off the same trick against Sukuna twice in 2 chapters doesn't seem like something that will necessarily work. Are you telling me, genuinely, that you believe the King of Curses could fall into the trappings of the true strength of the copy technique not only once, but twice, and in the span of like 3 minutes? It just doesn't seem like something that would happen to Sukuna. And thus, while I am hoping with the entirety of my soul that this is what takes Sukuna off the battlefield, I can tell you with an almost equal amount of confidence that Sukuna will have learned from his little tangle with Inamaki and Hollow Purple. So genuinely, it feels as though it's a coin flip. Either, once again, Sukuna will be struck still by the maximum output Jacob's Ladder, which will allow for Yuji to land a flurry of dismantles aimed at the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's soul, which will cause him to puke up all the fingers and for Megami to return to the folds, or Sukuna will either avoid the maximum output Jacob's Ladder or simply make a binding vow to get out of it. I don't know, man. The Sukuna cycle's been going for over 40 chapters now. I feel as though I've almost been Stockholm syndromed to it because, my God, do I want this fight to be over, but at the same time, I feel as though I wouldn't know what to do without it. We've been fighting Sukuna for a year. And while genuinely this is probably the worst situation Sukuna's ever been in, I feel like I've said that no less than 6 times. On top of that, there is a growing sentiment in the JJK fandom that Sukuna is not the final boss of JJK. And thus, when Megami and Sukuna's souls are truly and finally separated, that Megami will arise as the true final villain of JJK, on account of everything he's been through. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Do you think that 3 binding vows in 19 pages is too many binding vows? Do you believe that Hana has finally finished off Sukuna, or at least put him in a situation where Yuji can do the dirty work? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I just know for a fact somebody's gonna be like, oh, you forgot when Todo described the binding vow on his binding vow that allowed him to only use the bell part of his Viper Slap? What are you, some kind of idiot?